morning, Team Alabama. We are ready for another chapter in the Lottery Rose. We are on page 153. Please find it on your Chromebook now. Chapter 12, page 153. Georgie flushed as he saw Mr. Collier watching him try to find an answer. "I just learned him to say Robin," he said finally. I wouldn't do him on a stage, and I don't like acting on a stage." Mr. Collier looked as if he understood. "Yes, many people feel that way about appearing before an audience. I have to admit that I've always had a secret wish to be an actor, though I'm afraid that I've never stood much of a chance of being one." He motioned to a seat beside Robin, inviting Georgie to sit and talk for a while. "Tell me, which one of the skits is the best in your opinion?" "The Mad Tea Party," Georgie answered without hesitation. "That one is more fun than any of them, especially the Mad Hatter. He's real funny, crazy too." The grandfather's voice was grave as he answered, "Yes, the Mad Tea Party is the thing to love while you're young, to still love when you're as old as I am. It means something very special to my daughter. A great deal more than do any of the others." Georgie was curious. "Why does she like that one best?" he asked, wondering at the sadness on Mr. Collier's face. "Paul had a Mad Tea Party role in his school play the first year that we came down here. He was the most pleased and excited boy that I ever saw. When he came home and told us that he'd been chosen for the Mad Hatter," the old jealousy rose inside Georgie, and with it the old sense of guilt that he was jealous of a dead boy. "Was he a good hatter?" he asked in a small voice. Why do you suppose Georgie's jealous of Mrs. Harper's son that died? Why would he be jealous? Do you suppose it's because he received all of the love that Georgie has never received? I don't know. Let's see. Mr. Collier nodded, barely smiling. "Yes, we all helped him with his role. His mother was Alice, his daddy and I took the roles of the March Hare and the Dormouse, and I remember that sometimes our foolish expressions would make Paul forget he was an actor, and he'd crack up in the midst of his lines. Robin couldn't have a part, could he? No, but his parents saw to it that Robin was included in the fun whenever he wanted to be. Occasionally, he'd come up babbling something that seemed to say that he wanted to be in the play, too. One of us would pick him up, help him pretend at pouring tea or at listening to the Hatter's big watch tick. We were always careful to see that Robin had a chance to join in Paul's fun once in a while." "I'm glad," Georgie said in a low voice. Mr. Collier looked out across the lake, and when he spoke, the words seemed to be said to himself. It was hard for her to do the Mad Tea Party with the boys over at the school, but she did, and in spite of her memories, my girl is a very brave lady. It was the first time Georgie fully realized that Mrs. Harper was Mr. Collier's daughter. That maybe he loved Robin's mother the way Sister Mary Angela's father loved her when he said, "No more sad stories for my child until she's older." Inside his mind, Georgie was saying, I wish. What do you think he wishes? That he had a parent that was like that? And instead, his mother was the one that beat him up with Steve, her boyfriend. But his mind couldn't quit telling him what it was he wished. Or couldn't quite tell him what it was he wished. That night he dreamed about being in a play and talking on a stage in front of a large audience, among them a tall rose bush. He heard Mrs. Harper say, "You're good, Georgie, you're very good." And then suddenly there was trouble about the Mad Tea Party. Timothy told Georgie all about it. "You know, I told you what she'd do to any guy that teased Kevin about taking the role of Alice. Want to know what happened?" "Yes, what did?" "It wasn't any big surprise. Richie had been grinning all week about Kevin wearing a dress when he plays Alice. Well, today he had to tease him or bust. So he did. And Kevin hit him. Richie's front tooth got run through his lip, and beside that, Mrs. Harper bounced him out of the play." Timothy shrugged in callous disregard for Richie's troubles. Georgie's heart gave an unreasoning leap. He knew, of course, that there was not the slightest chance that Mrs. Harper would call upon a sullen, loony-behaving Georgie to take the part, no matter if her father had told her how well he had said the lines down at the banyan tree. Still, Georgie couldn't help asking, couldn't she find someone else to take the Hatter's role in Richie's place? Wouldn't do any good, Timothy answered, 'cause after he'd punched Richie, Kevin got to crying and saying that he couldn't play Alice, and after a while he got so worked up that he puked all over the dressing room floor, and Mrs. Harper told Sister Mary Angela no, that she wouldn't ask another guy to dress like Alice because we ain't mature enough. So, alas, alas, there ain't no Alice either. Timothy grinned at his friend, happily indifferent about the folding of the skit. Timothy didn't know, Georgie thought, that the Mad Tea Party meant more to Mrs. Harper than any other one of the skits. During the following days, there was considerable grousing among the boys over the cancellation of the Mad Tea Party. Grousing might be a word you want to add. It's on the bottom of page 156. Reports had leaked out that it was the best of all the skits to be presented, and there was general disappointment. But Mrs. Harper was unmoved. No, she said to the few who asked her if she couldn't find someone to fill the vacant role. I don't think so. We'll have to wait until some gentlemen around here learn that girls' roles are just as good as theirs, and sometimes considerably better. I'd take a girl's role for her. I know I could do it, Georgie thought, but Mrs. Harper wasn't asking any favors, and nothing could have made Georgie suggest the possibility to her. He listened forlornly to Timothy's account of other troubles in the drama class. Rosita, it seemed, had made a mistake in measuring Larry for his John Silver costume, and when it turned out to be so small that the vicious old pirate couldn't get into it, he threw a very childish tantrum in front of the whole class. There was the case, too, of Ross Davis, who couldn't project his voice or enunciate his lines distinctly. Timothy chuckled as he told Georgie about it. Every time he says his lines, Sister Dolores sings out from the back of the auditorium, "Louder, Ross! We can't understand a word back here." And sometimes Ross looks like he wants to go out and drown himself. Georgie followed Sister Mary Angela into the organ loft the day before the skits were to be given, and listened without the pleasure that he usually felt as she played the music that helped him to rest and relax. When she was through playing, she looked down at him where he sat beside the organ bench. "Is my boy unhappy these days?" she asked quietly. "Yes, sister." "Do you want to tell me about it?" He tried to organize his troubled thoughts, and then he said, "Do you know that Paul was the Mad Hatter in the play one time?" "Yes," she answered soberly. "The Harpers and Mr. Collier invited Sister Dolores and me to go with him into town that night to see Paul's school play. It was delightful," she added. "He was good, wasn't he?" "Very good," she agreed. "His parents were terribly proud of him." Georgie said nothing more, and Sister Mary Angela sat quietly. The sunlight sifted into the loft and fell on Georgie's face. Outside, the yells of the boys on the playground were shrill and loud. Across the street, the buzz of old Eddie's lawnmower could be heard as he rode around the wide lawn that surrounded Mrs. Harper's house. "Sister, I wish I hadn't ever hated her," Georgie said after a silence between them had lasted for many minutes. She looked down at him, but she didn't speak. Georgie tried again to say what he wanted very much to say. "I wish I'd told her that I'd be in her class. Maybe if I had, she would have made me the Hatter, and I wouldn't have laughed at Kevin, and the tea party wouldn't have been spoiled for her." "I wish that too, Georgie. Lots of things might have been different, but then it's too late to think about it now." She rose, getting ready to go back to her work. "Why don't you go over and tell her that you wish that you had never hated her?" Georgie shook his head. "I just can't do it," he said miserably. Sister Mary Angela rearranged some books of music on the organ. "Then would you like for me to tell her?" she asked. And for the life of him, Georgie couldn't say yes, as he wanted to say. Instead, he muttered, "If you want to, you can." And his face grew red, and then Sister Mary Angela said, "Oh, Georgie, Georgie, that was a left-handed yes, wasn't it?" The next morning, everybody except Georgie was getting ready for the first production of the drama class, and there was persistent hammering in the auditorium and a shouting of commands among the workers. Rosita came hurrying over, her arms loaded with costumes that she'd just finished. Sister Dolores was in the dressing room, helping a couple of late learners with their lines. Page 160. Timothy was stationed at the stage door, forbidding any of the older boys to peek inside at what was going on. Georgie wandered from one spot to another and was painfully aware that no one, not Sister Mary Angela, not Timothy, not Mrs. Harper, paid any attention to him. Finally, he went into the front parlor where he curled up in an armchair, trying to read a new book that he'd found in the library, and discovering that somehow he had lost his taste for reading that morning. Mr. Collier found him there in mid-morning and drew up a chair beside him. Georgie, Sister Mary Angela told my daughter and me something last night that pleased us very much. She said that you wished that you had taken part in her class earlier. Georgie looked down at the floor, but Mr. Collier's next words brought his eyes up quickly. Do you think that you could do the Mad Hatter if my daughter gave you a rehearsal with the rest of the cast this afternoon? All the last traces of his resentment toward Mrs. Harper melted before the bright light of that moment. Georgie's face glowed as he answered, Yes, sir, I'll do it. I know I can. I know you can, too. I remember how well you did the parts for me that day down at the playhouse. I'm not worried about that. Are you worried about Alice? Can't she find anybody to take that part? I believe that problem is settled. No, Mr. Collier looked at Georgie thoughtfully. I want to be certain that you can bring yourself to forget your trouble with my daughter, Georgie, can you? I already have. I believe you. I wanted to hear you say it. All right, I'll tell her that you'll take the part if she feels that you can manage it. He got up and walked away hurriedly. The first 3 skits presented that evening were received with high enthusiasm by the audience. Timothy, as the White Rabbit, was convincing in his terrible worry over being late for an appointment with the Duchess, and earned a special round of applause for him. Tom Sawyer received waves of appreciative laughter throughout his performance as a master con man, and Larry, as Long John Silver in the costume completely done over by Rosita, brought down the house with a display of his chilling wickedness. Then, when Sister Dolores stepped out from the wing and announced that the Mad Tea Party would be given after all, the student body applauded wildly. Through the crack in the curtains, Georgie and Timothy could see the expectant audience before them, and Mr. Collier sat well up in front with Rosita on one side of him and Sister Mary Angela on the other. Robin was on his lap, leaning within the circle of his grandfather's arms. Old Eddie and his wife sat farther down in the same row with Amanda. Timothy proudly pointed out his mother to Georgie. She drove all the way down from Jacksonville just to see me do the White Rabbit, he whispered to Georgie. And when the curtains parted for the tea party, the audience buzzed in surprise at seeing Georgie Burgess seated at the tea table. High hat and tall collar, identifying him as the Mad Hatter. But as the Hatter, the March Hare, and the Dormouse looked out toward the right wing and began to clamor that there was no room for an approaching girl at the tea table, Molly Harper stepped out of the wing, and the room erupted with a delighted roar. There was an Alice the boys hadn't expected to see. She was wearing a short dress with a crepe paper pinafore that Rosita had pinned together less than an hour before. Her hair was loosed from well-known braids and fell back off her shoulders in a heavy golden fall held from her forehead by a velvet band. She was more beautiful than they had ever seen her before, and the play was delayed for a time by the audience's loud enthusiasm. When finally the dialogue began and the Hatter looked critically at Alice and remarked in carefully enunciated syllables, "You know your hair wants cutting," the audience broke out in laughter, and someone shouted, "No, no, Georgie, Mrs. Harper's hair doesn't want cutting." It was soon evident that Georgie had attended carefully during the hours when he sat at the back of the auditorium watching rehearsals and listening to Mrs. Harper's comments and directions. He forgot a boy named Georgie completely once the play opened and became a ridiculously pompous old Hatter who teased Alice and irritated her with his sly mockery. Okay, you might want to add pompous and mockery if you don't have your 10 vocab words. Those would be great to add. Page 163, pompous and mockery. The saucy lines which a Georgie Burgess behind the Hatter's big spectacles are glasses, dared to say openly to Molly Harper behind Alice's pinafore tickled the audience immensely. When the March Hare asked her please to have more wine, she replied angrily that since she hadn't had any yet, she couldn't very well take more. The Hatter was impudent. You mean you can't take less, he said smugly. It's very easy to take more than nothing. And when he waved his arms in an extravagant gesture as he recited, "Twinkle, twinkle, little bat, how I wonder where you're at," Alice looked at him in what was surely puzzled disbelief, and the audience howled at a Georgie Burgess they had never known before. It was fun. Heady, exciting fun. As the curtains began to close, Georgie wished desperately that the skit had not ended so soon. He looked up at Mrs. Harper and, under the stress of his excitement and the din of applause in the audience, he dared to speak to her of his feelings. "I wish we had words for an hour longer," he said. She laughed at that almost as gaily as Sister Mary Angela sometimes laughed. "Grease paint gets into one's blood, Georgie," she said. He didn't quite understand her words, but he was glad that he'd had the courage to speak to her as Georgie rather than as the Hatter. At curtain call, the 4 Tea Party characters came out hand in hand, and they bowed graciously to the audience. Then, as Mrs. Harper turned and stood facing the 3 boys, she bowed and smiled at them, and they returned the courtesy. It looked very friendly. Georgie hoped that it looked something like Paul's curtain call a long time ago. Boys by the dozen crowded around Molly Harper when the program was over, loud in their compliments, and Georgie stood for a moment wanting to speak to her, but still too shy to break through the crowd pressing around her. Instead, he slipped out a side door, hurried across the street, and opened the big gate at the entrance to the garden. Where's he going? Who does he want to talk to? Make a prediction. He sat down beside his rose bush, trembling with excitement and a happiness that left him giddy. "I talked to her," he whispered. "She asked me did I want to play the Hatter, and I said yes. She looked at me for a long time, and then she said, all right, but would I be in the play if she took the part of Alice, and I said I would. And then I asked her, but she wasn't too big, and she laughed and told me to remember the little cakes that made Alice grow big when she ate them." The rosebush looked more beautiful in the moonlight than he had ever seen it before. "I was good. I know I was," he continued. "I said the lines and never stumbled. Sister Dolores was in the wing waiting to give me a cue if I needed it, but I didn't, not once. I said the lines the way the Hatter would have said them, and Mrs. Harper thought that I was good. I didn't ask her, but I just knowed it." He paused, and for a long time he didn't speak, and finally he drew a leaf down where he could look at it closely. "I liked her tonight," he said in a very low voice. "I liked her a lot. I wish she was my mother, same as she is to Robin and to the boy that died." "Maybe she is, Georgie," the rosebush seemed to whisper so faintly that Georgie was not quite sure that he'd heard what it said. He felt a shiver go through his body. "Maybe she is," he said softly, not daring to say the words that were in his mind. "Maybe in a time before I can remember, there was a fairy that was mad and took me away from her and gave me to mean people for a long time till finally there was a place, there was me and my mother being Alice and the Hatter in it together." He sat unmoving, listening to the night sounds in the garden, and he saw Mr. Collier and Rosita walking slowly across the street with Robin between them and Amanda following close behind. Later he heard the din of his classmates' voices calling good night to Mrs. Harper, and then he saw her walking quickly up the garden path, stopping once to wave back to her admirers. He wanted to go out and speak to her, and to ask if she liked his acting, and to tell her that she'd been a real good Alice, and that her hair was prettier than any he had ever seen. He wanted terribly to hear the good things that she might have to say to him. But in spite of all of that, he drew back into the shadows. "Not yet," he thought. "Tomorrow I'll talk to her. I'll tell her for sure tomorrow." There you go, guys. That's the end of page 166 and the end of chapter 12. Please add a few facts about Georgie and what it was he just did, and maybe a little bit about his change and his feelings towards Mrs. Harper. Have a great rest of your day, Team Alabama.